reading from the book of Luke. Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and asked him a question. "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married her, and so in the same way all 7 died childless. Finally, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her." Jesus said to them, "Those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore, because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living. For to him all of them are alive." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I read recently of a new TV show that I believe premiered a week ago on Friday, airing on Showtime. Maybe some of you have also heard of it or read about it. It's a show called Time of Death. To call it a reality show doesn't really seem a good, accurate description. One reviewer I read called it a docu-series. An unflinchingly honest one, he said, about what it's like to die. Now, I don't have cable, so I haven't seen this show yet. I imagine someday it'll come on Netflix and I will watch it then. But from what I understand, this show follows the lives of people from all different walks of life, young, old, middle-aged, with children, grown children, teenagers, all of whom are suffering from some terminal illness. And what this series does is it walks with these people and it follows them and their families in the final days and weeks of their life. This is not your typical Friday night curl up on the couch with a big bowl of popcorn, mindless kind of fare. But when I read about this, I was fascinated. Surprised, really, that someone out there in our world today would be brave enough to tackle this topic respectfully, with honor, but right in your face. It doesn't shy away from this awful, hard reality. Because as a culture, our usual approach to death and dying is one of denial. We have TV shows, movies, books, all just this plethora of things out there that center around death, that somehow take death and maybe as its leaping off point for whatever story it is that they want to tell. But all of these stories mostly serve to put death at a distance, to keep it away from us. Death in our society has become a kind of gruesome entertainment, sometimes to push death away from us as much as we can, for as long as we can. And yet, with all of this pushing away, we live, it seems, with this unspoken, maybe subconscious fear of death and what lies beyond. Our culture capitalizes on this. It feeds on that fear and that anxiety so that the overarching narrative of our lives together is one that constantly, chronically highlights reasons for us to be afraid. And then it tries to sell us solutions. It tries to give us ways to keep aging and sickness and death at bay, ways to numb our pain when the reality that none of us gets out of here alive gets too close. Now, that's not to say that there are not plenty of reasons for us to worry, to be sorrowful, to be burdened. This week, we all heard of the story of that young girl from Kettle Moraine who disappeared on her way to school. And thanks be to God, she's been found and she's safe, and that's wonderful. And yet, in those days where we didn't know, that fear strikes at our hearts. Our hearts broke for her parents and her family and her friends and her schoolmates. We experienced that anxiety of the not knowing and imagining what could be, and hoped desperately that we would never have that same experience with our own children and loved ones. We all have friends and family and neighbors, or perhaps some of us sitting here this morning who have gotten a dreaded diagnosis, whether it's cancer or MS or some other life-changing, life-altering disease, and we stand at the crossroads options and we look down the road and we just don't know where it will lead. We don't know how it will all turn out. Some of us know too well the pain of wrestling with mental illness, or the daily struggle against addiction to alcohol or drugs or pornography, and live with that desire to break free from whatever power it is that enslaves us, and know that we cannot do that on our own. We stumble at times through the grief of losing a loved one, the child who we long to raise and to know, our parents, the spouse you spent most of your adult life with. These are real sorrows. They rightly weigh us down because they are ultimately unavoidable, no matter how hard and how much time and energy we spend trying to avoid them. And the culture around us, as it glorifies death as much as it uses death for its own purposes, doesn't offer us much hope beyond death. For so many, there is this sense that death is final, that in the end, death wins. That's pretty much the attitude the Sadducees have in this story that Luke tells us this morning. The Sadducees we often hear about with the Pharisees. We don't always know what the differences are, but the Sadducees are the group of religious leaders who, Luke tells us, say there is no resurrection. This group holds only to the truths they can find written in the books of Moses. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. And from what they see there, this life is all there is. And that's all right with them, because for the most part, they had it good. They have power, they have prestige, they have honor, they have money. They're living a comfortable life. So what does the afterlife matter? Why worry about that when everything here is so good? But to deny the resurrection is to deny the possibility that God will, in God's time, set all things right. To deny the resurrection is to deny the hope that God's power will be made known, if not here in this time, in the age to come. To deny the resurrection is to deny the power of God over the power of death. For the Sadducees, ultimately, death wins. And so they come to Jesus, who is teaching in the temple, who's been having kind of one conflict after another at this point, and they bring him this ridiculous, trumped-up question about the marriage of one woman to a line of 7 brothers in a religious tradition that we don't really make sense of these days. And their concern, of course, isn't to find out what Jesus has to say about the power of life over death, but to trap him. They, along with the Pharisees and the scribes and the other religious leaders, have been looking for a way and a reason and a time to kill him. Here we are in chapter 20. Just go a few chapters ahead, and you will find Jesus there at the Last Supper, praying in the garden, being betrayed into the hands of the authorities, hanging on a cross, breathing his last breath. This is where we are, and Jesus knows all of this is coming. Way back in chapter 9, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, knowing that death waited for him there, and he has predicted that death as he's gone with the disciples 3 times. And knowing that this is what is coming, Jesus speaks not to the surface question, he doesn't into the trap, but he addresses this deeper longing that everybody else who is listening has. He's a smart guy, Jesus, so he pulls an example from the books and the person that the Sadducees will honor and respect. Jesus speaks of Moses. Moses, you remember him. He is a Hebrew, put in the water by his mama and raised up by Pharaoh's daughter. Moses sees the oppression of his people, and as he witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, he murders that man, and then he flees to a foreign land, trying to outrun his past and make a new life for himself. Moses is the one who, while he's out in the wilderness tending his father-in-law's sheep, comes across this bush, the bush that burns but is not burned up. And there, in the wilderness, with this mysterious burning bush, Moses encounters. In this anxious, fretful, fearful place, God speaks to Moses and calls him out of this place of death and into a place of life, giving him mission and purpose, sending him back to Egypt, back to where he came from, so that he may lead God's people into freedom. And Jesus, with all of this backstory, all the people listening knew this story, he sums this up with these powerful, hopeful words. Now, God is not God of the dead, but of the living. For to him all of them are alive. In the midst of these plots and threats and punishment and death lying ahead, Jesus proclaims this central truth, that no matter what the world says, no matter what the world does, no matter how powerful death appears to be, God wills life for God's people. And not just life after death. Certainly as Christians, we believe in and hope for and look for the life of the world to come. We can't predict what it will be like. We can't be certain how it will look. But it's not just that eternal afterlife that we are looking for and hoping for. Life here and now is what God desires for us. Life in the midst of all of the hurts and the pains and the little deaths that we die every day. Jesus promises his listeners then and now that God is not a God of the dead, but a God of the living. And what that means for us is that God is even now offering us life, new life, resurrection life. God is in this moment embracing us all across all time and space, bringing us to new life, Christ, every day. We get glimpses of this promise scattered throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. We get stories from the New Testament, and most clearly we see it in the Easter story. Jesus laid in a tomb beyond hope, and God raises him to new life. We hear God speak this promise in our own fretful, fearful places, in the rush of baptismal waters that drown us and raise us up again in Jesus. Waters where we hear the words, "You are my beloved child forever." We taste this promise in the bread and the wine that we share each week, this little piece of bread and this sip of wine that somehow is enough to strengthen and sustain us for the road ahead, because we know Jesus is present in us and in that wine. It's a little distracting. Sometimes that happens. We experience this promise of life and new life in this community of faith. The people who walk with us, who hold us up when we lack the strength to stand, who believe for us when we cannot find the faith to believe on our own. So know this morning. The world lies. The Sadducees were wrong. Death does come to us all eventually, but death does not have the final. Death does not win. Jesus says God is the God of the living. So wherever you find yourself this morning, Whatever burdens you bring to this place, whatever fears are weighing on your heart, whatever it is that seems dead in your life, hold fast to this promise. God is with you. God is holding on to you. God is lifting you up. God, the God of the living, is speaking to you, calling life out of death, offering us renewal, sending us into a hurting world with mission and purpose and hope. This is what resurrection life looks like. Life in the hands of the living God who will not let us go. Thanks be to God.